Okay. Our speakers this evening are authors Sabiha Raymond and Walter Ruby. Their book is called We Refuse to Be Enemies: How Muslims and Jews Can Make Peace One Friendship at a Time. It is a manifesto by two American citizens, a Muslim woman and a Jewish man, concerned with the rise of intolerance and bigotry in our country, along with the resurgent white nationalism. Neither author is an imam, rabbi, scholar, or community leader, but together they have spent decades doing interfaith work and nurturing cooperation among communities. They have learned that through face-to-face encounters, people of all backgrounds can come to know the other as a fellow human being and turn her or him into a trusted friend. In their book, they share their experience and guidance. Sabiha Raymond came to the United States in 1971. When her sons were school age, she earned her master's in healthcare administration and began a career as a hospital administrator. In 2008, she co-founded the New York Metro chapter of the National Autism Association and was its president. She has been doing interfaith work for many years and blogs on topics related to the theme of her memoir at sabiharaymond.com. She lives with her husband in New York City. Walter Ruby has worked as a journalist for more than 40 years. Since 2007, he has been an activist in Muslim-Jewish relations and presently serves as executive director of Jews, Muslims, and Allies Acting Together, a Washington area interfaith organization. Over the past decade, he has organized hundreds of twinning events, bringing together thousands of Jews and Muslims in over 30 countries on 5 continents. Thank you both for being here this evening. We really appreciate it, and I'm going to turn over the talk to you both.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. When I was growing up in Pakistan, I had never met a Jewish person. Pakistan is pro-Palestinian. It has still not recognized Israel and views Jews through the lens of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In fact, my father's passport was stamped all countries of the world except Israel. That is literally where I came from when I came to the United States in 1971. Walter, how about you?
Well, I had, thank you, Sabiha. I had never met a Muslim until I was well into my 20s. Even though I moved to Israel when I was at the age of 11 and 12. And that was because my father had gotten, was a physicist, nuclear physicist, had gotten a sabbatical year at the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot in Israel. So we went there, and I really came into my own in terms of my Jewish identity. I bonded totally with Israel and felt deeply at home and connected to my true self. But I had no interactions with Palestinians, either Muslims or Christians at that time. Our family moved back to the States after a year, but I vowed to return to live in Israel because I felt only there could I be happy.
The first time I met a Jewish person was when I came to New York. My husband was a medical resident. He took me to the hospital's Christmas party, and everybody that I saw were there, the residents. Half of them were Pakistani Indian and the other half were Jewish. And his Jewish colleagues were being very welcoming to me. And I had difficulty reconciling my original impression of them with how good these people were being to me. I later learned that my husband's boss, who was mentoring him, was Jewish. The woman who lived upstairs in my apartment building and had taken me under her wing was Jewish. Then I get pregnant and my obstetrician is Jewish. I have a baby and my pediatrician is Jewish. And I then end up buying a home in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. My father, who was visiting from Pakistan, was very impressed by our neighbors. And he said to me, people of faith, no matter what their faith, make good neighbors. These families will be good for your children because they will raise their children with values. He was right, but I also ended up getting a bonus out of it. I no longer had to tell my children why we don't have a Christmas tree and why we don't eat pork. How about your first interaction, Walter?
Well, again, it goes back to Israel. I did come back to live in Israel at the age of 26 and as a potential new immigrant. And I stayed there for 3 years, which were really the happiest and most fulfilling of my life, I would say. I became a journalist while I was there, and I covered many stories that showed me the systematic discrimination being endured by Israeli-Palestinians. That is, say, Palestinian or Arabs living inside of Israel, not even in the West Bank and Gaza. This was mostly in the Galilee, which I lived in Haifa in the north of Israel. But I learned even a more important life lesson in those visits when I went out to the Palestinian villages, which was the transformative power of personal encounters. The whole point that when you meet someone from the other side, you encounter, you talk, you learn, and obviously I had a chance to do that as a journalist. It really transforms the whole dynamic, and you're able to see that person as a full human being. And one Palestinian Israeli who impressed me greatly was Father Elias Shakur, who was a Greek Catholic priest who organized self-help efforts in some of the Palestinian villages. So the point was, though, that I would go back to my Jewish friends in Haifa and also some of my family members on a kibbutz not far from the Arab villages there. They basically said to me, well, Walter, you're a nice guy, but you're kind of a naive American. You don't really understand what's going on here. You don't know the Arabs. We do. And I remember having this discussion with my uncle Ze'ev, who was really a role model for me. He was someone who had come to Israel before it was the state of Israel, built the kibbutz really with his bare hands, fought in the first war. And so in any case, I went there and I said to him, Zev, I've met this amazing person. Father Elias Shakur has taught me so much. And I remember, not only Father Shakur, but many of the other Arabs there. And he kind of rolled his eyes and said some of the same things. So one point, and I'll read from our book, We Refuse to Be Enemies, just a couple of a paragraph or so. I said, I went back at one point and I said, Zev, let me just ask you something. Have you ever been to Ibalim? Because after all, it was only about 10 kilometers away from his kibbutz. And he said, of course I have, to which I asked, when was the last time you were there? He furrowed his brow, and then he replied after some thought, well, as far as I recall, I was there once in 1943. Of course, this, when we were having the conversation, was 1977. So he saw my eyebrows go up and he responded forcefully, okay, so it's been a while since I've been there. So what? Don't think for a moment that just because you were there a few weeks ago and got sweet talked by that priest of yours that you understand the Arabs better than I do. Listen, I don't need to go to Ibalim to meet Shakur and the others in order to understand what they want, which is to destroy the state of Israel as soon as they can. And one way they're trying to accomplish that is by pulling the wool over the eyes of Jewish dreamers like you. Well, I had to take seriously what Zev said, because after all, I was a newbie there, but what I was seeing was that he didn't know any Arabs personally. Many of my other friends didn't either, and yet they told me they knew the Arabs better than I did. And what I took from that is that, yes, ultimately, if we're ever going to get anywhere with these conflicts, with the two sides demonizing each other, we have to make these personal encounters, and that's really been the story of the rest of my life. And I learned that at that point. Sabiha?
So my personal encounter started by the sidewalk. I would be hanging out with my Jewish neighbors on the lawn. I guess that's where grassroots came from. And we would be watching our children. I was a homemaker, chatting. I must have invited one of them over for dinner, and the conversation would have led to dietary restrictions. And now we are saying, oh, so you don't eat pork either. She must have invited me for coffee. And I would have said, I'm sorry, but it's Ramadan. What is that? And that's literally how Interfaith Dialogue started, by the sidewalk. And at one point, I realized that it would be nice if my Jewish friends could meet my Muslim Pakistani friends, because I didn't want them to feel that I was an outlier and unique in some way. And at the same time, I thought it would be nice if my Pakistani friends could meet my Jewish friends, excuse me. So we started meeting in my living room. And eventually that led to dialogue in larger spaces, in public spaces. How about you, Walter? How did interfaith dialogue start with you?
Well, it really started, as I said, as a journalist, first in Israel, and then I returned to the States in 1980. I became a reporter for Israeli and Jewish newspapers, American Jewish newspapers, mainly based in New York, but covering the peace process. I was at the UN for many years and really covered the ins and outs of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process over, say, 15 or 20 years, and really believed we were gonna have peace in the 1990s, and it was something that I was a witness to history, and all of that meant a lot to me. But then it all crashed and burned in the early 2000s, literally, and the violence renewed, and it was horrible, and it was devastating for me personally. And I became, I would say, in the early 2000s, interested in Muslim-Jewish coalition building efforts in the US as a possible alternative path to peace and reconciliation. I thought one thing that was very, very important is that we don't import the hatred and fear and loathing that exists unfortunately, in Israel-Palestine to the US, and God forbid have violence over here. So I was fortunate that in 2008, I was hired by an old friend, Rabbi Mark Schneier, the president of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, gave me a title, Muslim-Jewish Program Director at the foundation, and I held that job for almost 10 years. And it turned out to be an endlessly fascinating and uplifting job that allowed me to travel widely. And basically, my job was to organize twinning events, twinning mosques and synagogues, and Muslim and Jewish organizations, women's organizations, youth organizations, on campuses, et cetera, across the US, and also eventually also in Europe and other countries, even in places like Morocco and Tunisia. Anyway, the whole thing was an absolute revelation for me. It went much better than I had expected at the beginning. Yes, there were challenges and setbacks, some of which Sabiha and I will talk about a little during this talk, but it was just so exciting and fulfilling to bring together grassroots Muslims and Jews and watch them connect, recognize their commonalities, and build ties that allowed them to work together. It really felt to me like I was doing holy work.
So holy work had ground rules. We agreed that we will focus on commonalities, our shared heritage and our shared values, and we would keep politics out of it. In fact, one of the organizations, the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom that I belong to, has a rule, which is that for the first 18 months of a chapter's formation, you will not discuss politics, allow time for relationships to develop and for trust to develop. So for the first 18 months, we did not talk politics. After 18 months were over, we still did not talk politics. Another 18 months went by, we were still not talking politics because things were going so well that nobody wanted to rock the boat and wade into murky waters. But then this year, when the Gaza conflict erupted, we did make an attempt to talk politics in some chapters. We were given some clear guidelines. In some cases, it worked very well. In other cases, relationships did unravel. So it remains a delicate balance going as we continue with the situation. Walter, tell us how our paths crossed.
Well, Sabiha, our paths crossed, I believe, in 2009 or 10. And that happened because I was, as I mentioned, reaching out to many Muslim organizations and Jewish organizations to bring them together. One of them was called, as you know, the American Society for Muslim Advancement, ASMA, which was headed by Daisy Khan in New York. And so I called Daisy in that period and got Sabiha on the phone instead. Sabiha worked closely with Daisy. And so we developed friendly relations and always enjoyed talking to each other, but I think neither of us had any idea at that point where the relationship would soon take us.
Where that relationship took us was that in 2016, my memoir was ready to be published, Threading My Prayer Rug. And it occurred to me that it would be nice if I could get an endorsement from a rabbi. I thought of Walter. Walter is not a rabbi, but he worked for one. So I sent him an email. Walter, I'm publishing this book. Do you think that Rabbi Schneier would be willing to write a blurb? And Walter's appropriate response was, I have to read the book. So I emailed him the manuscript, and this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on Saturday, read the entire manuscript, emailed me and said, Sabiha, the rabbi will be happy to write a blurb. And I have an idea. Why don't the two of us write a book? Why, Walter? Why did you come up with that?
Two reasons. One, I loved your book. And if any of you have not yet read Threading My Prayer Rug, I strongly recommend it. It was a delight to me, just in terms of its honesty, its humor, its thoughtfulness about life in general, about the coming together of different groups, so the building of the Muslim community in America, all of that. So I loved it. And the fact was that I had been looking for a Muslim co-author for some time who was also a good writer. So I said, here she is at last. But why I had been looking for such a co-author, because I had wanted to write a book with a Muslim co-author about our Muslim Jewish movement, and really to share an account of that success, because I felt not enough people knew or even know about that today. And I felt, and this was already around 2016, 17, when we decided to work on this, that we needed a manifesto as to why a Muslim-Jewish alliance was so needed at this moment in history, when both of our communities feel threatened by the rise of bigotry and authoritarianism. I felt that as the two largest minority faith communities in America, Muslims and Jews need to stand together in support of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom, all of which make Muslim and Jewish life viable in this country. So that was the idea. I was very happy and grateful that Sabiha said, all right, let's give it a try. We sat down together with a tape recorder, and I believe in Sabiha's apartment, New York, right, probably early 2017, which, as you remember, was a pretty fateful time. And one of the things we decided was, we identified 4 principles that really were motivating the Muslim-Jewish work that we were both involved in, and the alliance that was growing. So we wanted to, we laid them out in the book, but we wanted to share them with you here at least cursorily. The first one of the 4 principles is the principle that it's called, if you save one life, it is as though you save all of humanity. Now, this particular aphorism is both in the Talmud and it's in the Quran, 2 of the main holy books, obviously the Quran, the main holy book of Islam, and the Talmud, one of the most important ones in Judaism. So to me, that was very, very important. Obviously, I knew that this was, I knew as a Jew that this was in Judaism. It was a central tenet, but I had no idea that I hadn't know until that point that it was in the Quran. And it illuminated for me that at the heart of Islam, like Judaism, there is a commitment to mercy, compassion, justice, and the preciousness of every single life. And I wasn't alone as a Jew, and I would think a fairly well-informed Jew about Islam, and not knowing that that was in the Quran. I think even today it may be 1 out of 100 Jews who's even aware of that it is in the Quran, and probably 1 out of 100 Muslims is aware that it's in the Talmud. There are other such important pieces that are in both faiths that we don't know about each other, and that's why this work is so important. But this is, I think, one of the central tenets, and it really is something that unites us and brings us together in a very uplifting way.
The second principle that unites us and is common to us is welcome the stranger. There's a passage in the Quran and in the Torah about the importance of welcoming the stranger. And I think about my mother, who was a refugee. In 1947, around just a year before Israel was formed, Pakistan was formed. The Indian subcontinent was divided and partitioned and separated into India and Pakistan. My mother lived in India. She made the trek all the way across to Pakistan with her family. They got on a train. On the way, the trains were attacked and thousands of people were massacred, going both ways. She barely made it across. And then in her new land, she was welcomed. He was made to feel at home. He was a stranger in that land. And yet, until her dying day, she believed that if there was one place on God's earth that was made for her, it was Pakistan. That's where she thrived, and that's where she lived. Fast forward to 2017, and the presidential election has taken place, and Muslims are feeling threatened. I'll read just a bit from our book, Welcome the Stranger. I have never been inside a mosque, Rabbi Warnberg said to Khalid. Khalid is my husband. Khalid called the Islamic Cultural Center of New York and made an appointment for the rabbi to meet with the imam after Jummah prayers. Should I remove my kippah? The rabbi asked as they entered the mosque. Keep it on. The rabbi was very noticeable as a Jewish person. He sat down on the prayer rug beside Khalid, listened to the imam's sermon, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the congregation in prayer. As soon as the prayer was over, people started walking up to the rabbi. Thank you for coming, they said as they shook his hand. A distinguished-looking elderly man dressed in a white shalwar kameez walked up to the rabbi. I would like to give you a gift, but I have nothing on me. He then held out his hands and showed the rabbi his prayer beads. This is my family heirloom, and I would like you to have it. It was in those dark days that we witnessed many silver linings. We witnessed the best of America. It was Martin Luther King who said, only in the darkness can you see the stars. Right, Walter?
Absolutely. And Sabiha spoke about her mother, and my mother was also a refugee, happened to be a refugee from Nazi Germany, or a Jewish girl who grew up in Germany, and then the Nazis took over. And in 1938, when she was 14 years old, she and her mother fled for their lives, literally across the, running across the German border into Belgium, and not knowing if they would be shot in the back. They managed to escape then, but then they went to France, trying to find a way out of Europe. And while they were in France, in the south of France, the Nazis conquered France. So then they were literally running from port to port like, animals trying desperately, desperately to find a way out from every place, and finding that the road to Palestine was blocked by the British blockade, and the road to America was blocked by the fact that the U.S. was I think shamefully, it was at a period also of America First kind of ideology, and there was actually a movement called America First where the immigration was kept to a very low level, and certainly Jews were kept out, and as a result, hundreds of thousands died. My mother managed, just barely, she and her mother, to get on a boat from Lisbon, Portugal to the US, crossing the Atlantic when there were all the German submarines going back and forth, the U-boats. But they didn't have visas to the US. The idea was that they were supposed to go on to Ecuador, where they had managed to acquire visas. They wanted to stay in the US, so when they got to the to New York Harbor, my grandmother was taken by a Jewish organization called HIAS, which still exists, to see if they could find someone who would take responsibility for them, someone with the same last name, which eventually they did. But it took about, I think, a little bit more than a week. And during that time, my mother was held as surety on Ellis Island. So, so that was the situation that she went through. And then, but eventually was able to stay and lived a long life in America, and made, I think, important contributions to this country in many ways. I had the chance to tell this story in 2018. There was a protest in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, basically appealing to the Supreme Court not to, to rule that the Trump travel ban or anti-Muslim ban essentially was unconstitutional. Tragically, the court did not do that, and they ruled 5-4 in favor of Trump at that time. But I said, at that time, I said, everything that my mother went through in those terrible years when she was running for her life, Muslims today trying to escape Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, Yemen, they're going through now, and they're being, just like my mother was pushed away, these folks are being pushed away today, and it's shameful and it's un-American. So that was my situation, and without that story. And then we want to go on to the third principle, which is the third principle that unites our communities is, we call it Islah and Tikkun Olam. So Islah is an Arabic word that is translated as reform in the sense of to improve, to better, or to put something in a better position. Tikkun Olam in Hebrew, it means repairing the world. And both of these terms over the centuries have come to connote social action and the pursuit of social justice, and conveying the common moral imperative in both of our faiths to help those that are most in need. That's, I think, what's really at the core of it. So we've really been able to really bring that to life by holding joint Muslim-Jewish events, focusing on feeding the hungry and homeless, sometimes visiting sick and elderly people of all backgrounds, cleanups, environmental cleanups of parks and other areas, health fairs where we encourage Jewish and Muslim doctors together to treat folks without health insurance. And it's just, these things are so very, very meaningful. To be at a homeless shelter with standing side by side, a Jewish man and a Muslim woman, serving hot food to hungry and homeless people is so powerful in a way that, you can have a lot of intellectual discussions, but this really drives home one of the main things that unites us. Sabiha?
So the fourth value that unites us is standing up for each other. And here's an example, and I'll read again a bit from the book with the chapter called Standing Up for Each Other. On a bright sunny Sunday in February 2017, soon after the travel ban was announced, my husband and I stood in Times Square amongst thousands waving posters, "Today I am a Muslim too," except that they were not Muslims. They had come to stand in solidarity with us. It was organized by Walter's organization, the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. I walked through the crowd and stopped in front of a lady in a wheelchair. She must have been in her 90s. She could barely lift her head. Think of what it took for her to be there. Someone must have helped her into her woolies, put her in a wheelchair, wheeled her out of the apartment, into the elevator, hailed a cab, lifted her out of the wheelchair, folded her chair and put it in the trunk, got her to Times Square, got her out. I'm breathless just talking about it. This was a Sunday. All these people from the East Coast could have been anywhere on their day off, yet they gave up their day to come and stand up for their fellow citizens, Muslim Americans. And then, only a few days later, the tables were reversed. And now it was turn for the Muslims to stand up for the rights of their fellow Americans. Tell us about it, Walter.
Well, the day that stays with me vividly in a terrible way was October 27th, 2018. And that was the day I got up in the morning, like millions of others across the country, turned on CNN to see the Sunday shows and found out that a gunman, neo-fascist, neo-Nazi gunman, had broken into a synagogue in Pittsburgh, my hometown, and had murdered at the Tree of Life synagogue, and had murdered 11 Jews at prayer. It was a shocking event, because it had never happened in the entire history of the United States that Jews had been attacked in such a way, had been killed simply for being Jews. And you can imagine the kind of memories it brought up. And I suddenly had this feeling for the first time, for the first time in my life, I don't feel safe as a Jew in America. It was a horrible feeling. But even as I was sitting there absorbing all this on TV and having this terrible feeling in my gut, I saw something else. I saw on the TV pictures of a group of Muslims in Muslim dress standing outside of the synagogue, outside of the Tree of Life, with posters proclaiming their love for the Jews inside and saying, we want to help, tell us what to do. It was interesting because this they were from the Islamic Society of Pittsburgh, and they had built a relationship over the previous years, a twinning relationship with the Tree of Life. And at that moment, they were there. They knew them, so they rushed over. And they announced at that time that they were going to carry out a fundraising campaign on behalf of the Tree of Life. That quickly became a national Muslim fundraising campaign, and within 72 hours, they'd raised several $100,000, more than $200,000, which was quite remarkable. And then finally, and it really moved a lot of Jews, including me, obviously. The following Shabbat services, the following Saturday services, there were services for the Tree of Life in synagogues around the country. But what was noteworthy was the thousands and thousands of non-Jews, including many, many Muslims, came to those services. And I remember being at one in Northern Virginia, not far from Arlington, Falls Church, actually, and Temple Road of Shalom. Some of you may know it. They held a really beautiful service, but the place was jammed, and there were, I would say, of the 2,000 people in that synagogue, I would say a third of them at least were Muslim. And there was a Muslim man standing beside me. I noticed him. He was there with his two children, and we kind of reached out to each other. At some point, I just kind of reached out and hugged him and said, "I'm so happy you're here. It means so much, But I want to ask you why you decided to bring your kids, because after all, this is a pretty heavy subject." And he said, "I have to be here when my brothers and sisters are attacked, and I want my children. It's so important for me that my children may need to be here too. They need to see this. They need to see this. They need to understand where we need to be there for those." For our brothers and sisters. It was such a powerful moment. And Sabiha talked earlier about, in the darkness, you see the greatest light. And that was it for me. And I almost get teary-eyed just remembering that day, just how powerful, how important it was that they were there for us.
It hasn't always been easy. We have had successes, but we've also had challenges in interfaith dialogue, that is. One of the challenges that I have had to deal with is it's been a struggle to mobilize Muslim participation. There is some degree of resistance, and I am not sure what the reason is. It could be that we are still a young community in terms of not having quite evolved into activism. It could be that it's the immigrant trajectory. These are young families raising children, they have their jobs, or it could be that there is a level of distrust. Whatever it is a struggle. Walter, you had challenges too.
Well, sure. And Sabiha, Sabiha talks very candidly about the Muslims holding back in certain places. And I've had the same experience with the Jewish community in a number of cities, that the Jewish community is held back. I've also seen Muslim communities hold back in different cities. And it's very hard sometimes to understand why in this city, the Muslim-Jewish relationship has gone from strength to strength, and others it's been harder. It's often about when things don't go as well as we would want. It has to do with really two of what we call the elephants in the room. One of them is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we've talked a lot about. And it seems that when there are eruptions of violence in Israel-Palestine, often involving Gaza, and this has happened 3 or 4 times, unfortunately, since I've gotten involved in this movement, you see people who have already formed good relationships and done twinning events together, rabbis and imams, let's say in San Francisco or Denver or wherever. Suddenly they're not calling each other. And so in my job at the foundation, I used to say, it's already August, we're having twinning in November. Let me see what's going on. And I'll reach the rabbi or the imam, and they're sort of shamed. They're kind of like embarrassed. And they say, well, actually, I haven't called him. I've just been feeling so weird and uncomfortable about what's been going on over there. And I just don't want to have that conversation. So I've been kind of procrastinating. And that's one of the elephants. Usually we get it back on track after some time, but it does set us back quite a bit. There's another elephant, though, that's less well known, but it's there, and it's doctrines in our holy books, our respective holy books, that offend the other. And there's plenty of that in both the Quran and the Torah. For me, I would say that I've personally had issues with how the Jews are presented in the Quran. You know, it seems to me that the way that they are presented is in kind of a hectoring way of condemnation, like, what's the matter with you? You know, you were chosen among the nations to get the word, and then you know, didn't listen to what God said. You were on the way to, you know, the Exodus from Egypt, and Moses went up on the mountain and came back with the 10 Commandments. And what were you doing? You were worshiping the golden calf, and what a sinful bunch you all are. And and so when I read it, and I'm reading it in English, obviously, I found that, you know, that disconcerting. And I would reach out to some of my Muslim friends, and some of them learned imams, and I would say, well, you know, what about this? And what they said to me was, well, Walter, what it says in the Quran is exactly what it says in the Torah. And I, you know, I had to, you know, I thought about it, and I said, you know, they're right. It does. If you read the Torah, there's plenty of times where the prophets upbraid the children of Israel for not listening to God's message. And so what did this tell me? When I thought about it, it said to me, you know what, we Jews, like Muslims, like African Americans, like Hispanics, like almost any group, are okay with criticizing ourselves. But, you know, when somebody else says something very similar, we're like, oh my God, that's anti-Semitism. And so I had to, so anyway, that conversation with those imams made me, you know, grapple with that, made me think about it, and made it possible for me to move on. And so that is really the message that one of the most important messages that I think is so important to our movement and our work is, you know, when these things come up, when these, you know, issues come up, these elephants in the room, you've got to pick up the phone and have that conversation, even though it's often an uncomfortable conversation, but it usually leads to growth. Sabiha?
Yeah, and as we try and lead to growth, Walter and I have learned some lessons along the way, which we would like to briefly share with you. We detail this in the final chapter of our book. So it's an 8-point thing. The first is that we are Americans first. And while the Israeli-Palestinian conflict matters deeply to us, we live here, not there. And this is our common homeland, and it is threatened unless Muslims and Jews come together to save democracy and pluralism. We cannot afford to let the Israeli-Palestinian conflict divide us over here. If we look at what happened on January 6th, that was just the prologue. We've seen where that has led: voter suppression and so much more. And if we are to survive in the United States and preserve democracy and pluralism, we need to come together to fight bigotry and hatred. Number 2, speak out and stay engaged together against injustice, both here at home and overseas. Number 3, Muslims and Jews should support the work of NGOs in Israel-Palestine, which are working to improve the conditions on the ground over there and save lives. And as an example, Walter is involved in Project Rosanna in Israel-Palestine, which transports sick children, Palestinian children from Palestine into Israel daily for their treatment and brings them back. And just one example. And number 4, allow others to speak out even if we do not agree with them. Now, representatives in Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have said things that have hurt the sensibility of the Jews. But they have as much right to advocate for Palestine in the halls of Congress as do the Jewish members of Congress, like Senators Chuck Schumer and Ben Cardin. Walter, you want to walk us through the last 4?
Yeah, a very important one is we should not allow the Israel-Palestine issue to be weaponized in ways that drive our communities apart. And we honestly see this a lot coming from the political, from the political leadership, whether it's the White House, whether it's Congress, that oftentimes they're doing things that really push us apart, in trying to look pro-Israel. For example, a lot of states have basically criminalized BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is which seeks to put an economic cost on Israel for its occupation. And I personally am opposed to BDS. I think it goes too far in many ways, but I think they have an absolute right to advocate for an economic boycott of Israel or anywhere else that they find problematic. And there's a long history of that, and so the criminalization of that is deeply offensive to me and worrisome. It's in terms of civil liberties here. We even saw it this summer. I'm sure some of you remember with Ben and Jerry's, that Ben and Jerry's said, well, we're not for boycotting Israel, but we are for saying we're not going to sell our ice cream in the occupied Palestinian territories. And they, the various states are coming down on them like a house of bricks, and divesting state funds from Ben and Jerry's and their parent company Unilever. So New Jersey just did this. So this is very problematic, I think. So that's number 5. Number 6, let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. So Sabiha mentioned Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, I agree they absolutely have the right to speak as proud Palestinians, and someone like Linda Sarsour also, but sometimes they do, I think, go far in ways. They demonize Zionists. For example, Linda Sarsour made a statement some years ago that it's impossible to be a Zionist and a feminist, which was, very problematic. Many of the founders of the feminism were Zionists, were Jews who were supporters of Israel. So that's an example of demonizing in a way that's counterproductive. Following up on that, number 7, Muslims should engage with mainstream American Jews who consider themselves Zionists, rather than allying exclusively with anti-Zionist fringe groups, Jewish fringe groups. In the same way, Jews need to engage with Muslims like Tlaib, Omar, and Sarsour. We need to dialogue with people with whom we may disagree on Israel-Palestine, but do agree on many other issues, including advocating for diversity, freedom of speech, and democracy here at home. Again, we can't let Israel-Palestine overwhelm the causes that unite us here. And finally, number 8, let's be cautious about labeling one another as anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. Both communities have deep sensitivities, but criticizing Israeli policies is just that, a criticism of policy. It's not a declaration against Jews. Likewise, being critical of the leaders or policies per se, say of a Muslim country, does not translate into Islamophobia. So that's, and nevertheless, we need to be keenly aware of this heightened sensitivities on both sides. We both have plenty of persecution complex, I think, going back a lot of years, and we need to not wander into that. So anyway, that is really, that is our presentation, and we're really, really happy to have this opportunity and would love to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you both for presenting. We have one question so far in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee. This person is a member of the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom Arlington chapter. They say it's been incredibly meaningful developing deep friendships, as we do have so much in common as Jews and Muslims in a predominantly Christian society. As you mentioned, there is a shared agreement around the danger of far-right white nationalism. Can you address their discomfort with domestic social justice organizations tying their work to the Palestinian cause? This results in many Jews passionate about the important work of Tikkun Olam to step away from engaging.
Can the person who's asked the question be more specific, because for us to know exactly what he or she may be referring to?
If the person who asked the question would like to type a follow-up, please do. For the rest of the attendees, you are now able to unmute yourself and ask a question at any time.
I would just say without, as we wait for, if the person does want to add to it, it just does, I think he or she has, made a very, well, she, I guess, because she's from the sisterhood, has really put her finger on some of the issues that Sabiha and I were fleshing out in our 8 points that unfortunately, because of Israel-Palestine and these disagreements, which often come up at times, especially at times like this year, last May, when there was this eruption of violence in Israel-Palestine, that has really, it does drive us apart because we get so self-righteous, I think, on some levels. Maybe that's too, we get self-righteous, we get anguished, we feel for our brothers and sisters in those places. And, that's all legitimate, but, we do need to remember what drug brings us together here. And we can't allow it to overwhelm the important work we're doing here. I think that would be the key point.
Okay, they did ask a follow-up as an example. Standing up for racial justice are doing local anti-racist work, but then came out against Palestinian oppression. So can you answer their question a little bit more?
I would say that if they're speaking up against Palestinian oppression, they have a right to speak up and voice their opinion. And it is not being done under the guise of the sisterhood. It's not the sisterhood that is taking that position. It is a particular organization that is doing that, and they have a right to speak up. I don't think that should be held against them.
No, I agree. We don't want to. I don't think Sabiha and I are saying that we want the issue brushed under the rug. It's too big. It's too big under that rug at this point. And so we do need to deal with it in many ways. And that's why one of the things Sabiha mentioned, Project Rosanna, that I'm involved with, and it's a way of us. After all, I think one of the things is that Muslims, Jews, and others, Americans, they look at the situation over there and they get, either they feel really helpless and hopeless, we can't do anything about it, or it makes them angry, it makes folks angry on different sides. But what if we were to say, look, let's get behind groups over there that are doing life-saving work. And Project Rosanna is one example, where we're saving the lives of Palestinian children with cancer by getting them to these hospitals inside of Israel. Just one example of many wonderful groups that are happening over there. But for us to support those kind of efforts can be very empowering for us, because it gives us, a foot in the door. We can make a difference over there. And so that's very important. So I think there are ways we can address Israel-Palestine in a positive way. But again, while understanding that we are here, as Sabiha said, we are Americans first. And we have a responsibility both to our own communities and to the larger American community to work together with people to save democracy and diversity and human rights and all those things that really make our lives livable and over here and tenable.
While we are waiting for more questions, let me just fill in this time by sharing a story that someone related to me very recently. I am part of a group called Daughters of Abraham in Dialogue, and one of our members told us that Yom Kippur just passed, that she has a 7-year-old grandson, and he asked her that, "Grandma, what is Yom Kippur?" So she started explaining to him that, the night before Yom Kippur, in the evening, we stop eating and drinking. And then the next day we don't eat or drink anything. And then at sundown, we break our fast. So the little boy says, "Oh, so that's like Ramadan." And she said, "How do you know about Ramadan?" He said, "Oh, my friend Ali told me all about it." And now this is a 7-year-old boy, and he knows about Ramadan, and he's telling his grandmother, I know all about it. And I thought that is just so sweet, and that's only in America where you find that kind of coexistence and getting to know one another and diversity and all the good things that come with that.
Absolutely, Sabiha. And I think that that part of this is just, is being in the same communities and going to the same schools, and that's also so very, very important. And also, I think the work that many of us have been doing over the last 15 or 20 years has had an effect of bringing together thousands and tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews for twinning events, for encounters of all kinds of different kinds across the states. It's one of the untold stories of the last 20 years. And I think it's a very important one, and it is having a positive effect. And we've seen much, the two communities coming much closer together over, especially I'd say in the last 5 years, based on the work that was done in the preceding 10. So there's hope.
We have another question on the Q&A. Have either of you worked or collaborated with any, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, Baha'is in your communities? This person is asking, particularly Mr. Ruby, having lived in Haifa, has at least perhaps had the opportunity to visit the holy places there. And they also comment that they would like to commend you as your work is so very important.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, I did live in Haifa. I lived right, a few blocks from the Baha'i Temple, which is just a, very beautiful building in Haifa on the Carmel and on the mountain. Very, very, and beautiful gardens. And I've always been inspired by the Baha'i movement, and I don't know a huge amount about it. I mean, I don't know the doctrines all that well, but I feel instinctively very close to Baha'is, and that's another point that brings me to another point which I wanted to make, which and I'm sure Sabiha would agree with, is that we have focused a lot of our work on Muslim-Jewish relations because we feel that these are two communities that, because of Israel-Palestine, have tended to be in conflict or to look on each other, even in a place like America, with distrust and, oh my God, that's the enemy. And so we've seen it as very, very important to do that work. But that doesn't mean that we're exclusive. It doesn't mean that we only do Muslims and Jews, or that Muslim-Jewish relations is the quintessence. So I think we're both of us are also very active in larger interfaith efforts with Baha'is, with Buddhists, with Christians, with Hindus, and all of that. And that's so important. And with people of all faiths and no faith, who together are trying to build an America that's just and equal and a good society. So we see ourselves as part of the larger effort as well.
We have a few more minutes for any last minute questions. Again, you can unmute yourself or ask in the Q&A, but before we go, I would like to remind everyone that you can find We Refuse to Be Enemies on the library catalog. You can borrow it from the library. If you do not have the chance to borrow it from the library, I would urge you to buy it from an independent bookseller like Loyalty Bookstores or One More Page Books. Those are some of our local bookstores. And if you can't support your library by borrowing it from us, we would love you to support your local bookstores.
Thank you, Megan, for the shout out. Appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And there was a follow-up comment from the person who asked the last question. She says, thank you. And she feels the same as a Baha'i.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Since we're coming to the end of our presentation, again, I urge you to ask any last minute questions, but I will ask you both if there are any other authors or books that you could recommend to our viewers if they want to learn more.
I would recommend The Faith Club. It is not a recent book. It was written after 9/11 by 3 female authors, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, who got together and explored their differences and their commonalities. It was very well received. Walter?
The one that I would say is written by my old boss, Rabbi Mark Schneier, and Imam Shamsi Ali, called Sons of Abraham. And their book has some similarities with ours, but it's written by a rabbi and an imam, and so it's probably more based in theology and and sort of less grassroots perhaps than ours is. But I think it's a good complement, and it does go into some of the same issues and some different issues, and like, so that's a very good book.
Oh yes, Threading My Prayer Rug, One Woman's Journey from Pakistani Muslim to American Muslim, by yours truly.
Hear, hear. That's my favorite. That's my
Thank
favorite.
you.
Well, on that note, since there are no additional questions and we have come to the end of our hour, I'm going to thank you both for joining us tonight. This has been a very interesting and engaging talk. So thank you for telling us about your book and your experiences. And we will all, I think, try to get our hands on a copy.
Please do.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you all for joining us and for your questions.
Good night, everyone. Thank you all for joining us.
Bye.